I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Rick Smith is a technologist with the vision of making the bullet obsolete. That's right, the bullet, and therefore killing a thing of the past. He founded TASER International in 1993, but as the TASER device became ubiquitous in law enforcement, Rick pushed the company to a broader purpose of matching technology to public safety needs to make the world a safer place. Under his leadership, the company has grown from a garage in Tucson, Arizona, to a NASDAQ-listed global market leader in conducted electrical weapons, body-worn cameras, and software. In April 2017, TASER International changed its name to Axon Enterprises to better represent the entire network of devices, people, and applications they represent. Today, more than 18,000 law enforcement agencies in more than 100 countries are a part of the Axon network. Rick has devoted his career to understanding why and how we kill each other. But his biggest gun battle looms ahead. In his new book, The End of Killing, How Our Newest Technologies Can Solve Humanity's Oldest Problems, he reviews the history of weaponry and warfare, as well as the latest technologies in crowd control, surveillance, and artificial intelligence. He delves into the big, thorny questions about how technology is creating more tools for police, homeland security, and military, and offering more options for our personal safety and our justice system. With clarity and conviction, he challenges the conventional wisdom on these subjects, showing how technologies that appear strange and scary at first can be the key to making the gun a relic of the past. On today's show, Rick joins us to talk about how gun deaths are a technology problem that he has the answer to. But the greater challenge may be a story problem. He shares his approach to storytelling with the belief that a story is the only way to change an entrenched view into a vision of new possibilities, like making the bullet and therefore killing obsolete. Can Rick Smith really make that happen? Well, let's hear how he intends to on today's Business of Story. Rick, thanks for being on the show.
It's awesome to be here, Park.
Now, TASER International has become kind of a household name through all the work you have done through law enforcement. How did you get into this? Was this something that you wanted to do at an early age, or how did you find this line of work?
Growing up, I was always inspired by science fiction. And when I went to college, I studied neurobiology. I wanted to build Luke Skywalker's robotic arm. I thought.
And you went to Harvard, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're at Harvard studying neurobiology, and ready to build the arm.
I was fascinated by the idea of the human-machine interface. Cyborgs, what could we do in the future to augment the human capability? And then when I was in graduate school, I was living in Europe for a year. I was supposed to be going to school. Candidly, I had a train pass. I was traveling every week. I was having a great time.
And where were you supposed to be going to school?
University of Leuven in Belgium.
Oh, okay.
And while I was there, I was getting into these conversations with these European students who were saying things like, well, I'd never want to go to America because the gun violence is so rampant and there's gangs everywhere. And I'm telling them, of course, it's not like that. Don't believe what you see on television. My hometown's great. You should come visit me. And one of them said, well, do you know anybody who's been shot and killed? And about a year before that, 2 of my high school football teammates were shot and killed in the parking lot of a golf resort right here in Arizona. And not by some gangster, but by a businessman with a gun and a temper. And the situation just spun out of control.
And that was 1991?
I think that was in 90. It was in
90.
December of 90. And you sort of reflecting on that, when you lose an argument and then it just eats away at you later, I couldn't get it out of my mind that, man, maybe they're right. Within a few days, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that they'd just come out with the firearm gun death stats, and there were 37,000 people who died of bullet wounds. And I remember thinking it had to be a typo. There's no way the number is that big. Well, it turns out it is.
37,000
per year.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, more people have been killed in the past year here in the United States by people using guns than have been killed in the past 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan put together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big problem. And the light bulb that flashed on for me was, well, wait a minute. This is an area, this technology is arcane. This is a medieval technology.
Guns and bullets.
But yeah, we're firing hot lead at people.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that still a thing? We fought the British, 250 years ago with this technology. And sure, it's been industrialized and automated. And, I have nothing against guns. I bought my dad a gun for his birthday one year. But it struck me that there deserves to be a better way to do this. And of course, being a science fiction fan, I immediately jump right to, well, Captain Kirk would never blow a hole in a Klingon with a bullet. He's got something better, something more elegant, something where you don't have to take a life. And in particular, I thought about the situation my friends were in. That guy who shot and killed them didn't send out to kill anybody that night. He had a gun for self-protection, and he got himself into a situation where the gun was the wrong tool. And he's spending his life in prison. Corey and Todd are dead. I think those sorts of tragedies are far more common than what we'd envision. If you buy a gun, you're thinking about using it. Yes, if it's Hannibal Lecter and he's chasing you through the shopping mall, absolutely. Gun's the right tool for that job. But the fact is, most of the time you have to defend yourself. It's your house. It's the middle of the night. There's a noise. Something's moving. You just woke up. You're half awake. And now you have to make a life or death decision. And this is how people end up shooting their spouses and their kids. And that's where having something that is reversible would be a huge step forward. Most rational people don't want to kill someone. And the idea behind the book was to challenge this presumption. I don't think we're going to change anybody's mind on the gun control debate. And sorry if that sounds fatalistic, but we have had this debate for decades, and there are two very strongly entrenched camps. And I don't think we're going to solve the problem by yelling more loudly at each other. But the way we as human beings solve problems is we invent solutions and we move forward. That's called progress. And that's where I wanted to challenge this presumption that, maybe instead of thinking about school safety in terms of do we arm every teacher with a gun or do we try to take everybody's guns away? Well, what if we thought about some new approaches where we could use automated systems that could be deployed remotely so you don't have to wait for the police to get there? Mm-hmm. What controls would we put in place? And of course, we don't want lethal robots roaming the skies or roaming the hallways, but you could think about things that deploy, whether it's pepper spray or electrical weapons or tranquilizers. There's lots of creative approaches. And we could think about maybe having a controlled system where a police dispatcher, and you might have a 2-key system where before it gets deployed, right, you have to have some administrative oversight. The minute you start arming every teacher in America, you've just introduced a whole bunch of uncertainty because they're people like you and me. They're going to make mistakes. They'll leave things out.
Oh, and just picture those crowded classrooms and a teacher, goes off and that gun accidentally goes off and accidentally kills that child.
Well, some of the best trained police agencies in the country. I mean, cops train with their guns all the time, and they have accidental discharges about 1 out of every 1,000 officers per year. So that means if you put 3 million teachers carrying guns, if they are as talented as the best police officers, they would have around 3,000 accidental discharges per year in a school. That's that
That's
carries
a
some
problem.
risk.
Yeah. And we'll go back to how you started TASER and what pushed you forward on this, because I think your technology background to where you are today in making the bullet obsolete is really important. And I remember that shooting incident back in 1990. I didn't recall it until I read your book. And then it flashed in my mind like it was yesterday. And the reason why I remember it is I had moved down here to Arizona in 1985. And back then, there weren't a lot of road rage and drive-by shootings and that sort of thing that I had experienced. I got married. We had a couple young kids. And I remember reading in the paper about that shooting of Saguaro Chaparral. Chaparral High School. Very great neighborhood, school at the Hyatt Regency in North Scottsdale. People thought was a businessman. So didn't look like a hood out there. It took him quite a while to finally track him down. And I remember reading that and just thinking, oh my God. I mean, if that could happen to them in North Scottsdale, it can happen to anybody, anywhere. And it was just so amazing when I, reading your book, saw that account. I go, I remember exactly reading that. And it was the first time that one of those drive-bys or road rage really affected me. And I thought, my goodness, we have to pay attention now.
You're right. That's when I think for me and for many people here realized, this isn't happening just in the dangerous parts of town. It can happen anywhere.
Yeah. So here you are, you're answering that question overseas. You were thinking about your friends that you lost, working then on your background from your studies in technology and neurobiology. How did you end up doing TASER? How did that all come together there?
There was actually one other piece of the puzzle. So my mom calls me and she's back in Arizona. I'm in Europe. And she says, hey, I'm going out this weekend to buy a gun. I said, whoa, what's going on, Mom? Well, there had been some gruesome murder in the neighborhood that was in the local paper. My dad was commuting and didn't feel safe. And in that moment, I'd been having these conversations and I said, well, geez, Mom, are you sure a gun's right for you? Like, what about a TASER? And I don't even know where the idea had come from. TASER was already in the popular media. It'd been in Time Cop, the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie, and it was in some Clint Eastwood movies.
But there were more props at that point. It wasn't really working in real life, was it?
It was a real product, but it had not been very successful. Mm-hmm. It had more notoriety than success. Mm-hmm. And so my mom said, oh, that's interesting. I'll check. And a couple of days later, she calls me back and she says, well, I went to the gun store and they told me that the TASER is illegal. I can't buy it. And I remember thinking, wait a minute. You're in a gun store where you could buy an AK-47 and you could buy the Dirty Harry 44 Magnum, and you can't buy a TASER? That makes no sense to me.
A non-lethal TASER.
Yeah, you can't de-escalate. Like, how does this happen? So I started doing some research on it. And what I discovered was the early TASER, it had one key design flaw. It used gunpowder to launch these darts out. And by law, that makes it a gun. But they designed it to look like a flashlight. And that's because the inventor, I would later learn, wanted it to be a practical and useful device. So you could use it like a flashlight or defend yourself. The problem is it is illegal to disguise a gun as a flashlight. And so he launched the product. And weeks later, the federal government showed up at his doorstep and said, look, you're basically selling something that's the equivalent of a sawed-off shotgun. This thing is illegal. And by then, this was back in the mid-'70s. He had been working on this for almost 10 years. He was a prolific inventor.
From NASA, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was one of the lead scientists on the Apollo project. Mm-hmm. And he was at North American Aerospace, the prime contractor. After a long, hard journey, they got shut down by the government and the whole thing imploded. So I discovered through a patent search that he lived in Tucson, Arizona, because that's where his address was listed on one of his patents. And so I literally dialed 411. Remember that?
The old days.
Google days?
Yep.
I 411'd him and I called. He answered the phone and I said, hey, Jack, I've been reading about you. I'm fascinated by the TASER. And he invited me down to his house. Next thing I know, I'm standing on his doorstep. I'm 23. He's 73. This little old man opens up the door and it was literally something out of like a Marvel comic book. He looked kind of like, who's the guy from X-Men? The professorial bald guy in the wheelchair, Xavier. Yeah. He had this kind of mad scientist sort of look, and he opens up his front door and he lets me into his house. And he had spread out like a museum of TASER history. He'd been working on this for like 30 years.
And he knew you were coming, so he spread.
Yeah, he had everything spread out. Sometimes when you go see your grandparents, elderly people, they have a lot of stories to tell, right? And so this guy, he's walking me through this history. And I remember he showed me he had this buffalo gun they had built for large animals. And he showed me videos of them dropping buffalo.
With a taser?
With
buffalo
a
gun?
taser buffalo gun. He showed me he had these prototypes of like the James Bond version, he called it, which was disguised as a pack of cigarettes. And as I was talking to him, I was amazed by all the creative energy that had gone into this. But then I also sort of realized why the business had never been successful. It's because he was such a creative inventor.
Yeah.
He was always inventing things, right? When you're an entrepreneur, you have to stop inventing. It's like, okay, time to stop reworking the thing. We got to get to market. And so I saw an opportunity where I said, look, Jack, I want to give this another shot. I'd like you to join forces with me. Let's start a new company. I'll raise some money from friends and family. And next thing I know, we're starting in his garage in Tucson, building TASER prototypes to get rid of the gunpowder so that they would no longer be firearms and they would be legal under U.S. law. So
you have been called the Steve Jobs of technology for law enforcement.
That's a few people have said we're pretty innovative. It's obviously, though, it's a hugely flattering comparison.
It is. And I go back to when you were a young man, did you ever see yourself being here, or was it just those intersections in the universe of that question coming out? Have you ever known anyone to be shot? And then you thought about what happened, and then your mom wanting a gun, and does it almost sound like the universe is piling on you saying, here, dude, you have to go do this?
Yeah, certainly this wasn't something that growing up I imagined I would be doing. I couldn't have imagined a job this cool. I mean,
you have the coolest offices anywhere, by the way. When you come in, you get the retinal scan and then the door opens up and all that's very cool.
We are inspired by science fiction. We have a little bit of fun with it. That when you arrive at work, we want you to feel like you're stepping into the future to help build the future.
Well, and it is. I mean, you walk in your offices, 3 or 4 floors here, 5, I don't know what it is, but you do feel like you just entered the bridge of maybe the latest USS Enterprise. I don't know.
Thanks. That's the goal. Yeah.
It's cool. So you talk about in your book that killing is a technology problem and you can overcome that. So I asked, how do you do that? We'll talk about that. But to get people to buy into it, aren't you really dealing with a story problem?
Oh, absolutely.
And how do you deal with that?
So part of it, you've got to actually tell the story of human history in a slightly different way. Because we all understand history as, well, we used to be cavemen with only clubs. And over time, we got deadlier and deadlier. And war fighting machinery and weapons have been one of these core themes of human history. It's one of the things we have always done. But what's actually happened that most people don't realize is over the past 5 centuries, the amount of killing in the world has dropped dramatically. Since World War II, it's fallen off a cliff. The fact is that we used to kill each other for all sorts of crazy reasons. We burned people at the stake because we thought they might be a witch or they had a different religious belief. The Mayans sacrificed children, and the French would even trade criminals if one town didn't have one for the weekend's execution. I mean, it used to be entertainment value. And now we look at this and we say, well, of course we don't do those things. But we do accept this idea that we still kill people in the name of self-defense. It's the one time, if you're going to kill somebody in America and not go to jail, the only rationale you can have is that you are defending your life.
Is that uniquely American?
I think it's true around most of the world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously, there have been some societies that maybe backslid into more medieval forms of government recently, but I think those are anomalies in the vast majority of the world.
But the idea is don't tread on me. And if you show up in my home looking to rob me and I've got a gun, I have every right to take you out.
Because that is the only option that I have that will reliably stop you.
Mm-hmm.
And our police customers, for example, police officers, when they get in a shooting, you will always hear some version of the words, I had no choice. I was afraid for my life. It was a lethal threat. I had to use lethal force. But what most people don't realize is police are not legally allowed to shoot you for the purpose of killing you. They cannot shoot to kill. They shoot to stop the threat. And the thing is that historically, those concepts have been linked together. Yes, if I'm going to stop the threat, the only truly reliable way to do it is to kill that person. And that's where we can separate those two. If we had Captain Kirk's phaser that was more reliable than a gun and reversible, then there is actually no longer a justifiable reason why you would shoot and kill someone if you could do the same thing without killing them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a little risky when I wrote the book. I was a bit nervous. Our law enforcement customers, they have a very intimate relationship with their guns. It is their lifeline. And I have been just amazed at how positive they have reacted to this story of, hey, we don't want to take anything away from you. You should keep your gun for the next several decades because you may need it. But we need to give you better tools. And when you think about a police officer going to a house where a neighbor calls and says, hey, I heard shots next door, and they're going in. They have no idea what's inside. If they've got a gun in their hand, you basically have a human being who has to make a life or death decision, potentially in under a second with imperfect information. And there's a very good chance, whoops, the person I just shot and killed was a 13-year-old with a cell phone, not a gangster with a pistol. And it's just impossible to expect a human being to get those complex decisions right every time.
You hear about that all the time. And just right here, was it Chandler or Gilbert? I was out of town and got back and heard that another officer accidentally killed a 15-year-old who he thought had a gun, but it turned out to be a toy gun.
Yep. We can't expect officers to take a knife to a gunfight, so to speak.
Right.
So today, the non-lethal weapons, including the tasers that we make, are not as reliable as a gun yet. But that's why I wrote the book now. You have to set goals. You have to say, look, this is our moonshot. We're calling the shot. We will get there. And within the next 10 years, we will deliver a weapon that doesn't kill, that's as or more effective than a bullet at taking you down and stopping the threat. And almost universally, I've had very positive reactions from officers saying that would make a huge difference for us. None of us get in this business because we want to hurt anybody, but we have to do the job. It's a dangerous job with the tools we have today.
Yeah. So you are still going up against this story of I've got a gun. If someone's coming after me, I need to be able to use it. How do you change that? You talk in your book about the story of visibility, of making killing more visible. Do you mean by that more tangible, more visceral, or what do you mean by that?
I think it's already happening. Like today, there are so many cameras everywhere. Cell phone cameras, CCTV cameras. Now police are wearing body cameras. That in the 1970s, if police shot and killed somebody, you would hear about it, but you wouldn't see it. Now we're seeing it. And so even though the world is less violent than it used to be, there's more scrutiny on it. It feels
and we
more
see it
personal.
more, so we all feel like we're in greater harm's way than we really are.
The paradox is we feel like the world is more dangerous because we're seeing more of it. And I actually think the positive side of that is it's motivating us to fix these problems. Because now when you can see it and it hits you, in your gut when you see these terrible things happening, that creates motivation that says, look, we need to take this more seriously. There's much more pressure to reduce police use of force today than there was 20 or 30 years ago. And I think part of that's because it is more visible. It's bringing more attention to it.
Now, Rick, you took this, you and your brother, I guess, got the patents from, was it Mr. Cover?
Yep.
The designer of it. So essentially took TASER from a garage in Tucson and built it to a publicly traded company now over the course of, 20 years? 25 years. You've moved from just TASER into a more overall technology company and have changed the name to Axon. But in that process, you have come under fire, pardon the pun, from a lot of different people and a lot of different organizations, namely the NRA, for one, that's saying that we shouldn't legalize these. We should not make these available. It'll never replace the gun. And one of the regulations that blew me away was in 2002 in your book when you talked about the NRA and their lobbyists said, no, let's arm pilots with guns in the cockpit, but not allow them to use a taser. And the first thing I thought there is, here's a person already under stress flying an airplane. Let's now add stress to somebody trying to hijack the airplane. And we're expecting that pilot to be able to use that weapon accurately to, knock down the threat and not put a hole in the fuselage, not blow up the plane, not kill another person on the plane. When a taser, you're going to be at short range anyways, are you not? Because you're in an airplane. Wouldn't that make the most sense? So when I look at that and I tell myself that story, I think, how can, on one hand, we be so stupid to say, yes, that projectile in that fuselage makes sense versus this non-lethal taser? How did you overcome that? And how did it actually make your brand more resilient when you had to come against that?
Well, we to be honest, that's one that we never effectively overcame. Obviously, after 9/11, everybody was shaken. And then United Airlines reached out to us. They put a team of experts on their cockpit safety, obviously. And they looked at all the options, and they were the ones who concluded, you know what, a taser is actually a great choice for an aircraft for all the reasons you talked about. If there's an accidental discharge, it's not going to down the plane. The pilot, if you think about it, if you're sitting there, if you're firing over your shoulder, the ejection port of a pistol is right in your ear. Very difficult shot to take. And then finally, one of their concerns was the minute you put a gun on a plane, now an informed terrorist doesn't have to get a gun through security if they can find a way to access the gun that's already on the plane. So it adds a new threat vector. I did learn at that point the power of lobbying, because we did not engage in a lobbying campaign. We thought, well, United has done this extensive study. They're a huge company. We're going to let them sort of carry the water, so to speak, because we obviously have a vested interest, and it didn't make sense that we'd be running around telling Congress that they should let United go out and buy our products. They'd already done that. And that's when I learned the power of lobbying, because indeed the NRA was very actively lobbying. And I think it was heartfelt. They felt that guns in the cockpit were the right solution for dealing with terrorists. You know, I think on a practical basis, United did the study and found that maybe on the balance of pros and cons, using non-lethal weapons could have had some advantages. The main thing I learned from it, though, is you got to have a team on the field. Like we should have been educating Congress, and we lost that one because they didn't hear our side of the story. They only heard one side.
And did you think that the rational, they would look at the findings of United and they'd be rational and make a rational decision about it when, we Homo sapiens aren't rational beings?
Well, and politics are especially non-rational. Politics is a very sort of emotional game. And yeah, it was an important learning for me. Yeah. But, when you think about the power of story, actually, there's one way that I've used story that might be new even to you that I think your listeners might be interested in.
Love to hear it.
So back in 93, I'm debating about what to do with my life. I've had these incidents happen in Europe. I get back to the United States, and I've got one semester left of graduate school, summer school. And I'm debating about, well, this taser thing sounds interesting, but everybody I tell, they look at me like I'm crazy, right? You're going to do what? You're going to go make electric guns? And I remember I went up and I sat at the top of the John Hancock Tower in Chicago, and I got a highball of Jack Daniels, and I sat and I had a conversation with Jack about what I was going to do with my life. And what it really came down to is I realized, I could interview for a job, and I could go get a job. I got an MBA, I could probably get a decent job. Or I could go do this crazy, wild idea. I hadn't even met this inventor yet. I could go try to track down this NASA scientist in the Arizona desert and try to start a company to make the Star Trek phaser real. Even saying like that's crazy. And the thing that settled in for me was, if I go get a job, what's the value of that? Everybody does that. But if I go do this other thing, it will be the most amazing story. And I tend to use this idea that life is a story that you're living. And it's, what is the story you want to tell yourself? It's not, what are the stories you want to brag about to your friends? But as human beings, stories are the most powerful elements that motivate us. I'm a Game of Thrones fan. I love Tyrion Lannister. There's nothing more powerful than a story. And so for me, the deciding factor was, I'm going to go chase this because it's crazy, because it's a great story, because if I fail, then I can look myself in the eye and say, you know what? I gave it a shot. I won't be that guy who for the rest of my life says, oh, I had this idea once. I should have. I could have. Nope. I'm going to take a year and I'm going to go chase this down. And that's what I gave myself, 1 year. And if I fail, then I'll retreat and I'll go get a job. But I will have a clean conscience knowing I strove to try something great. And as I've hit through various elements, the story paradigm for me has been quite powerful, we've had some real downtimes. Like in 1999, we were out of money. We bankrupted my parents. I thought the company was going to fail. And I sat in my apartment and I cried. And I remember sitting in that moment, and you can either sort of boo-hoo, things aren't going well for me. And I remember I reframed it. Well, you know what? This is part of my story. This is a moment of challenge.
You know what Hollywood calls that? The dark night of the soul. You worked, you've pushed, you built, and then it feels like you're going to lose it all. And you probably went into your apartment that night thinking you're done. You bankrupted your parents. Yep. It's over. And you sat there and you said you cried. And then there must have been something that happened almost on the heels of that. Like it said, no, dude, you are actually on the right path.
It was you know what it was? It was at the end of that night, as I'm reframing it. In my mind, I had this insight that was, you know what? This is what great stories are made of. Like, you need a challenge. Luke Skywalker would have been nothing without Darth Vader. I mean, forget this. His father. Like, we don't write books and movies. We don't tell stories that go and then they go from the beginning to everybody was happy all the time from then ever after. Right? We as human beings, we need challenge. We need opportunities to overcome adversity. And so I found, and we've been through a number of these cycles where we've had these terrible downdrafts and it looks like we're about to lose everything. And for me to step back and sort of look at myself in the third person, I'm the protagonist in this story. What am I going to do about it? And it becomes this very empowering thing where it becomes motivating. Instead of focusing on all the negative things happening to you, you reframe it as, no, wait a minute. This is the darkness before the dawn. Like, if I can overcome this, that will be such an amazing story to have lived. And in retrospect, every one of those has worked out that way where, if you crater and you fold and it's over, then you lose. But if you keep persisting, that's where great things happen. And so for me, I tend to think of when I make major life decisions, Jeff Bezos talks about regret minimization is his approach. Mm-hmm. I have a slightly different spin on it. I tend to look at things like, what is going to make from the story that I'm living? Because all I have in life, really, I have the moment right here with you and the stories that led me here, right? The memories and the things that have led me through my journey. And it is the interest of that journey that leads to a rewarding and enriching life. And I found that is just a useful paradigm to never take maybe not never, but typically, you don't take the easy road that's not interesting. It is the more interesting road that leads you through a life journey that will take you to interesting places and make for a rich life experience. So when you look back at the end, you can say, wow, what a great story.
Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. I mean, you are on that and it perpetuates. You go through it and then you go through it again. So now you've taken on this big challenge of, do you believe and how will you do it in your lifetime that you can make the bullet obsolete?
Yeah, we have a technology roadmap to get us there. We've solved the hardest part. We know how to tune electrical energy to actually incapacitate somebody right now, faster than even a bullet can do it. The challenge is we can outperform a bullet in a laboratory, but the real world is not a lab. People wear clothes, sometimes very puffy clothes. Taser weapons usually get through the clothes, but not always. We only have 2 shots. A Glock has 17 shots. So we're into the engineering phase now. Okay, how do we always penetrate the clothing? How do we get more shots? How do we make our system more accurate? Maybe we even use some computer-assisted targeting. So if your hands are shaking, we can help aim the system for you to make sure it always hits the target. But we know if we can get a taser contact to the human body reliably, we can then outperform and immediately put that person to the ground. And so part of the reason for the book, too, is I'm trying to motivate my team internally, where it's like, hey, yes, this is going to be hard. Yes, it's going to take nights and weekends. We've got to think outside the box and try crazy ideas. But the payoff is, in another 10 years, cops aren't going to have to go into a building when they don't know what's inside and have to choose to take somebody's life in less than a second.
Yeah. And in your book, you use storytelling beautifully. One of your first chapters, you talk about how do you pronounce the name of the Middle Eastern city, Raqqa?
Raqqa.
Can you take our listeners as if they are now cozying up to your book Tell us the Raqqa story, because I think it does a beautiful job of illustrating what's going on in your head and what could possibly be in the not too distant future.
So one of the areas that there has not been a lot of traction with non-lethal weapons is in the military. And people tend to have this reaction, well, wait a minute, it's the military's job. It's their job to kill. No, it's not. It's the military's job to protect our national interest. And in fact, the types of conflicts that we're in today, we can't kill our way to success. These aren't the old trench warfare of attrition. We're in foreign lands where we're dealing with a very small number of terrorist type threats that are hiding in the local population. The most counterproductive thing we can do is to kill the wrong people. And the enemies, that's exactly what they're trying to spoof us into doing, to get us to
kill civilians,
kill a pregnant woman who's walking up on a checkpoint, or a child, or drop a bomb on a wedding party because they've spoofed us into thinking that it's some terrorist meetup, right? Those things are militarily very counterproductive, and they destroy American lives too. You know, I've met people along this journey who've killed civilians when they were deployed overseas, and it leaves them scarred mentally for life. So we open the book with a scene set in 2035 in Raqqa, Syria. And so we basically replayed, let's imagine a scenario like just played out in the Middle East. We have a town that's been overrun by some pretty horrible people. And those people have taken over the town. They're executing people. They're beheading folks. They're torturing people. Now, in today's world, if we engage, it probably starts with, F-35s dropping bombs from the air, destroying a lot. It's a hard way to be helped if you're on the ground. And so instead we said, let's reimagine how the military could work in another 10 years. So it's the middle of the night. There's a fleet of aircraft flying over the city. But instead, there's no explosions. You hear a faint buzzing sound that lasts for about 15 minutes, and it's over. The next morning, people wake up, don't really notice anything different. And we have a scene where we have this terrorist actor who is taking a victim, and he's going to kill him in the town square to make a statement. He walks him up to a telephone pole, chains his hands to it, and right as he's about to kill this guy, we realize there's a camera watching him from the nearest building. And then we realize that's not just one camera. There's about 100,000 of them all over the city. The aircraft that had flown over dropped a fleet of drones that set up perches all around the city, observing every public space. And we're transmitting those images back to drone operators in Las Vegas.
And these drones are like about the size of a dragonfly?
Well, we call them the dragonfly drones, just for a little bit of color in the book, but they might be about the size of a small DJI drone you can buy today.
Mm-hmm.
What I try to do is illustrate, we don't need science fiction to invent new things that don't exist. We could build this stuff with today's tech. So you have some regular consumer drone-sized devices that are transmitting video. You've got, teams of people in the United States monitoring this over satellite. And so now when our bad actor goes to pull out his knife to cut this person's throat, bang, you get the go order. But instead of dropping a bomb on him or something, the small drone leaps off the side of the building, flies down towards him, uses computer targeting, pumps 2 taser darts into him. Boom, electricity flows through him. He's incapacitated. He's on the ground. We have another guy who runs over to help. Of course, we have another drone that takes him down. And then we fly in a larger vehicle that actually grabs one of these guys and flies off with him. It's right. Again, is this creepy? Sure. It's kind of like War of the Worlds. But if it's my neighborhood, send in the terrorist snatching drones all day long before you drop bombs on my local infrastructure and potentially, kill my family.
But people would argue, well, they're horrible terrorists. Why not just kill them?
Well, the problem is you don't know who the horrible terrorists are. The whole thing they're doing is they're trying to spoof you into who they are and who they aren't. And so we end up killing the wrong people. But even in the case, I had a really interesting meeting with some military leaders who said, well, Rick, you're never going to convince me that guy doesn't need killing. And I said, well, what's it worth to get him alive? Because ultimately, the main thing you need to do is unwind his network. If you can capture him alive, well, now you've got a source of intel and you've denied him martyrdom. You've denied the recruiting heroism of martyrdom that has been used quite effectively by the types of organizations that recruit against us. And even though we think he's a terrorist, there are people locally who think he's a hero. And when he goes down as a martyr it inspires more people to step into his place. So we deny that whole cycle, and we can pull this guy away, and we can process him safely outside of the city by using an automated drone that carries him away. Now, again, that sounds a little bit science fiction, but right now, Boeing, Airbus, Uber, they're all building these manned transport drones for these flying car services. So we could just take the same technology, repurpose it. Now it needs a little bit of a facelift because we got to attach it to an unwilling person to fly them off. But this is not that hard a technical problem. You could imagine we could cover a city with drones that are able to incapacitate people, capture them, and take them away. I think it's actually more productive than even killing those people. And especially then in the book, we go into what future interrogation techniques may look like. You know, in the next 10 years, Elon Musk and Ray Kurzweil, who's one of the senior leaders at Google, have both predicted we'll have high-speed brain-computer interfaces where we'll be able to interact directly between our brains and the internet. Now, other people think that's a very aggressive timeline, but the value, what if you didn't have to torture people anymore? What if you could actually monitor their brain activity and know, okay, yeah, this guy is a terrorist. We can actually tell by his brain activity when we ask him certain questions through a very high resolution lie detection process, what he's actually done, and to be able to extract information about who's in his network without hurting anyone. And the point was to just lay out a story that says, we can imagine a better way. And when I show this to military thinkers, they agree. They say, you know what? Yeah, it'd be really valuable if we knew we could capture every terrorist alive and we could interrogate them even against their will and sort of download their contact list from their brain. We could roll these terrorist cells.
And you don't have to waterboard them.
You don't have to waterboard. You don't have to torture anybody. Mm-hmm. Now, it raises a whole bunch of ethical questions. One of the more interesting ones is, well, once we have this technology, under what circumstances would you use it at home, right? Well, I don't think any of us want the government rifling through our brains, but once the technology is here, we're going to have to deal with those questions. And I think if you flip it on its head, if we're talking about sending somebody to prison for life, we have an interest as a society in making sure we don't get it wrong. Mm-hmm. You know, I've heard the saying that a trial is basically a contest as to who can hire the better attorneys. Mm. You know, we all remember O.J. Simpson and Johnny Cochran.
If it don't fit, you got to quit.
Right? I mean, who
would have ever thought that tagline would keep him out of jail?
The power of performance and the power of money has a lot to do with justice. Mm-hmm. So I think if we had the ability to know the truth, then I think we have a moral obligation to get to the truth before we deprive a human being of their life and their liberty. Now, you're going to have to wait till this technology is more proven. You're going to have have very strict controls, just like we have warrants that control how the police can search through our homes or through our vehicles. We ought to start thinking about under what circumstances would the government be able to search through our minds. But there are conversations that we need to have because as these technologies mature, you don't want to wait and have the conversation the day after the tech has been released. Or that's like, you know, today where we find out my local police department's using facial recognition technology and nobody knew about it. And it turns out it wasn't reliable enough. The point of this book was let's start talking about these conversations now. Let's start thinking about what are the frameworks. And maybe that technology won't be here for another 100 years. But it's better, I think, to have at least planned for what you would do when some of these technologies become feasible. And it challenges the way that we think. Like ultimately, again, there's nothing worse you can do than kill somebody. You can scan my brain 5 times and tase me 20 before I'd want you to kill me once. And when we reframe some of these technologies against the state of the art today, I think we can see it's not a very high bar to make the world a better place by being a little more aggressive about how we use technology to avoid killing people.
Yeah. What does your gut tell you? Because for 25 years, you've built TASER, and I'm sure with all the technology, you have experienced Moore's Law, the compounding effect of getting better, faster, quicker, you know, in shorter amounts of time, that if you've got the likes of Kurzweil and Elon Musk saying we're going to be able to do this in 10 years, my gut kind of tells me we probably are going to be able to do that 10 to 15 years. I mean, it's not 100 years off before this happens.
Yeah, Kurzweil in particular does a great job of making his case mathematically, that when he makes these predictions, he models out this brain scanning technology resolution, the computational power it would take. He famously predicted when we would be able to sequence the human genome, reading the full genome of a human being. And when he made his prediction, people thought he was crazy, but he had just modeled it out, and he ended up being right, like within, I think, a year or two of the final date.
Yeah, because they were talking about thousands of years or something at first, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. Yeah. In the 1980s, the technology to sequence the genome would have taken like 10,000 years, but it was doubling in performance every year or two. And when things are doubling in performance, they hit these crazy performance curves. And all of a sudden, I think in the first 7 years of the Human Genome Project, they only got 1% of the genome done. And the critics would say, yeah, I see 7 years, we're only 1%. This is going to take 700 years. And I think Ray Kurzweil famously said, no, we're almost done when you get to 1%, because it keeps doubling. And 7 years later, they were done.
Yeah.
And the back 7. So I think the amount of technological change that has happened in the past 20 years will pale in comparison what's going to happen in the next 20 years. And that's what part of made The End of Killing such a fun project, writing this book, was this is an area that people typically don't think about applying technology. And it makes us uncomfortable because we immediately tend to jump to the negative stories about how the government might misuse this technology. And that's where I'm pushing back and saying, look, we can't expect the government to behave like it's 1970 and use typewriters and Post-it notes in the 2020s. We want our government to be data-driven, to be making good resourcing decisions, to be executing the enforcement of the law in a manner that is both effective and fair. And we need to squeeze the bias out of policing. You can't do it without data. I mean, basically the whole idea of biased policing is that we think, right, human beings make biased decisions, and these institutions may have historical legacies that may have bias in them. Well, the way you change that is by measuring it and having good data and using good data tools, including AI, that instead of reinforcing the bias, you have to be careful how you design it to make sure you're designing the bias out.
Final question for you on your book. It just has recently come out, The End of Killing. Who is it for, and how can leaders of purpose-driven brands, like, I think of TASER and Axon as being very much of a purpose-driven brand, The End of Killing. Who did you write this for, and what can people get out of it?
So I wrote it because I wanted to start a general conversation that gets beyond some of the most divisive issues in politics. Look, saying that police are racist, what good does that do? You're smearing an entire category of people. I don't believe it. But even if it was true of some subset, that's not a solution. That's a smear. So the question is, all right, yes, there are challenges in policing. Yes, people in general have biases. How do we get past that? How do we move beyond sort of this hyper-polarized time that we're in today? Do you either love cops or hate them? I say, look, you don't change policing by throwing bottles at them. You engage, you understand, you begin dialogue. One of the most effective things we've done, we created this AI ethics board where we've brought in some leading thinkers from civil liberties groups and police to sit in a room and say, okay, we're going to come out of here with solutions. We don't get to just point fingers and blame. Let's talk about AI. What are the problems? How could we use it more effectively? So this book was entitled to really engage the public at large in how could we think about these problems instead of name calling with a solutions mindset. And in particular, I've targeted police and said, hey, I'm going to challenge together. We ought to get past lethal force. Let's do it in the next 10 years. Let's set that as a moonshot. With the military, hey, let's challenge the military. How do we conduct our operations without killing people, without sending 18-year-olds overseas that have to make a kill or don't kill decision when a child or a woman is walking up on a checkpoint? That's un-American to put somebody in that situation. We need to give them better tools. I'm challenging activist groups to use the power of their voice and their platform to push for constructive solutions change. We can't just complain against the police. We have to help shift what they're doing. And that means actually giving them options. And many times that means new technology. And then I've also challenged some of the tech companies that are well-intentioned, but we can't have our brightest people just focusing on how to make us click on ads, right? We need our brightest people solving our biggest problems. So, there's this sentiment that, well, the tech companies shouldn't sell their technology to the military. And I give Jeff Bezos a lot of credit when he said, look, Amazon is going to support the military because this world will not be a good place if the best and brightest people in America aren't helping support and improve our military. You can bet in China and Russia, the best and brightest are absolutely helping the military. It is not in the interest of the balance of power in the world to see rising power in less democratic regimes. And the way you change the military is you don't change them by disengaging and letting somebody else solve the problem. Hey, if you don't like how the military is doing their job or how the police are doing, like, engage with them. Like, actually help solve the problems. Sitting back and criticizing, that's not going to change anything.
Yeah. How often on this journey of yours do you think back to your two buddies that got gunned down in that Hyatt Regency parking lot in 1990 and think they have had this tremendous impact in the success and the impact that you all have had out there?
Yeah, it's kind of a touchy subject. I generally don't try to talk about it too much. You never want to feel like you're leveraging a tragedy, for your own purposes. But I would say if there's some good that came out of that tragedy, that it has inspired me and now over 1,000 people that work with me, that was the inciting moment. And so maybe something good will come out of a terrible tragedy, that it sets the world on a slightly different direction, because we're motivated to not let that keep happening.
Well, and I see you as an entrepreneur and a technologist, but moreover, I see you as an activist. And I think that was the moment, at least for me, from reading your book, that has gotten you and us where we are today in the use of non-lethal weapons and have saved a lot of lives in the process.
That's actually a powerful point. Entrepreneurs are the most effective activists out there. Now, there are going to be some people who find that offensive. I was at NYU recently, and I was on a panel, and one of the students there, he sort of got up in my face and he said, "Hey, Mr. Smith, how much money have you made?" And I said, well, I wasn't expecting that question. And he didn't let it go. How much money have you made? And, so I sat back and I said, well, I've made in the tens of millions of dollars. And he said, well, how can we possibly trust you? And I said, well, let me challenge you back a little bit. If you want to make change in the world, there is no better way to do it than if you can become an entrepreneur. When you identify a problem you want to solve, I could have gone and started a nonprofit. And I have a ton of respect for people who do nonprofits. But on a practical basis, if you start a nonprofit, you know what you spend most of your time doing? Begging for money. You have to basically call and beg to try to get people to make donations. It is brutally hard. And you frankly, no matter how good you are, you cannot raise that much money from donations. But if you take the same problem, in my case, it's gun violence. Like, the last thing the world needed was me to go start another political organization. And again, I respect the people that do that. But instead, I looked at it and said, how do I create a financial model? Who will pay me to solve this problem such that I don't have to worry about going and raising money? And because we built a successful financial model that has funded this development, we've done well over $1 billion in sales since we started. We have a company that's now worth $4 billion. We have $350 million in cash. We have 1,200 employees working full-time on this problem. And we've saved roughly 200,000 people in scenarios where police could have legally shot and killed them, but they had a taser to use instead. I would argue we've made a far bigger impact. And over the next 20 years, we're now a $4 billion enterprise, and we're growing. By approaching this through the lens of entrepreneurship, we can focus far more resources and have a far bigger impact. Ultimately, the most successful philanthropist, I think, of all time will be Bill Gates, because not only did he change the world through his entrepreneurship and bringing a computer into every home, that was a dramatic change. He then took that wealth, and now literally we have one individual who's wiping diseases off the face of the planet. I personally get a bit offended when people vilify entrepreneurs. Sure, we can critique people, and yes, they've been successful, but those are the people who've changed the world unlike any other, and they're doing some really amazing work. So when I hear young people sort of take this fatalistic approach, oh, I don't want to get myself sullied by going into business, I'm going to do something pure, Like, look, if you go and volunteer in Africa for your life, God bless you. That's great. You'll do 40 man years of labor by yourself if you do it. If you find some other way to solve, maybe it's a clean water problem in Africa or something else, you find a way to turn that into a business model where you get 1,000 people working on it. You can
scale it.
You can scale it. You can actually have a much bigger impact. And oh, by the way, yeah, you can design it in such a way where you actually capture some of that value yourself. I think the capitalist system works extremely well at focusing resources. And it is a place where good people can do good work and they can enjoy the fruits of their own labor. You know, I'm very proud. We've created jobs for over 1,000 people. I've done well along the way, and our customers have had a really good experience as well. I'd like to see a change in the tone to where I think our best and brightest, what we absolutely want them doing is entrepreneurship. Go invent the solution to the next problem, scale it, and change the world. And there's no better way you can do it than right here in America as an entrepreneur.
Well, you're not exactly resting on your laurels, which you very well could be. You go out and you write a book. You've taken a stand. And as you said, that most CEOs are not encouraged to go out and speak their mind the way you have. And now you've brought in an even greater moonshot of ending killing as we know it, making the bullet obsolete. So,
you know, when you look at all of us deep down inside, we're like that kid that brought the art project home from school and you just want to see mom put it on the fridge, right? As human beings, there's nothing we enjoy more than to create things. And so, yeah, I mean, I've had enough financial success. I don't need to work, but I don't want to just go sit and eat bonbons. Like for me, this is the most exciting
thing. You're having an
do
impact out there.
I mean, it is self-actualization. Now, some people disagree with how I'm spending my life. Some people find business, offensive for some reason. I think they're wrong. I love what I'm doing. I get to work on problems I care about. And we can see the footprints in the snow from where we've been. When we look back, we know we're making a difference. And that feels really good. I mean, to me, that's what a fulfilling life story is all about. What is the impact you've had? Why is the world different for the fact that you were here? How did you impact other people? What are the relationships you've built? Have you solved problems that have gotten better because you've put effort into it? Those are all things that, lead you to a place of fulfillment.
And I think you've captured that in your book, The End of Killing. Where can people find it?
So it's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. It'll be in the airport bookstore starting in August. We've got a promotion running at Hudson. So it'll be, anywhere you would go to find a book, The End of Killing will be there.
It's terrific storytelling. It's futuring. You see a lot of sci-fi in it, and it's great to be able to peer inside your brain and see what's happening inside there.
Well, it's been fun to share it too. And I put a disclaimer on the front of the book that, look, I'm not just sharing the safe ideas. I'm sharing the kind of crazy ones too. Yeah. And I'm pretty upfront and say, look, I might be dead wrong on some of this. I've started a Twitter, conversation at #EndOfKilling. Hey, if you disagree with me, please don't just send me the vitriolic hate mail. Make your argument. And I'm open to it. Because I think I've learned if you only talk about the safe ideas, you miss some of the best ideas. So I didn't run this by our lawyers and get everything approved. This isn't the official plans of a public company. This is the musings of someone thinking, how do we take this to the next level? And I wanted to put out some of the more aggressive ideas, things like when we should arm drones, when we should use facial recognition, how do we defend our schools when an 18-year-old shows up with an assault rifle? These are really hard problems that I think we need to think about them differently. And I've been pleasantly surprised at how well some of the ideas, like the idea of putting non-lethally armed drones, I expected a ton of blowback. But once people sort of thought of it in an intellectual framework, it's been far better received than I even thought it would.
No Buck Rogers, I think, as they say. You got to keep pushing it out there. Rick, thank you so much for being on The Business of Story. Really fascinating book. Check it out, folks. And I appreciate you taking the time here.
There's nothing more powerful in the world than a story. And so I'm glad to be able to share some of mine.
Amen to that. Thank you all for listening to this edition of The Business of Story. If you liked what you heard, you found it controversial, you've got friends, family, loved ones that would be curious or maybe pissed off by Rick's approach on this, then by all means share this episode with them, because as he said, I think the most powerful thing we can do is continue the dialogue and get people from all sides of the aisle talking about this and where could we go to make the bullet obsolete and end killing as we know it. So please share this episode, and of course, if I can be of service to you, come on over to The Business of Story, where I have tools, tips, techniques, and talent there to help you craft and tell compelling stories that sell. Thanks for listening, and until next week, remember that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks for listening.